How's your Monday going, Richard? It's good to meet you.
Oh, yeah, good to meet you too, Dan. Real pleasure. Monday's going pretty well. I am not teaching today, so I spent the morning doing some review of travel award applications for a conference I'm helping organize, and then yeah, so this will probably be the highlight of my day. Huh?
Good. Okay, we'll aspire to that. What classes are you teaching this semester?
So this semester I'm just teaching a large section of learning and memory, which is my the brain region a lot of my work focuses on. Actually, it focuses on a few brain regions, but a lot of them happen to be really important for learning and memory. So the hippocampus is one of
Mm,
them. Prefrontal cortex is another one we worked with, and the basal ganglia as well is sort of an older part of my work life. So yeah, a lot of different memory loci within the brain that I am involved with, and so yeah, when I took the job, they were like, well, we need someone to teach this. So I've been teaching it for about 10 years now. It's about
I
100.
like the name of that class. I took one called Human Learning and Memory in college as well, and something interesting about that class was that we learned how to study for tests too, and it was a little bit high strung how the class was d- structured around how we should study too.
Yeah,
Like we
yeah,
we had reviews frequently, for example, which is soming we learned about, which helps to retain memories, for
right, right.
instance.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I sort of started off just teaching from the text because I hadn't taught it before, but yeah, over the past 10 years, it's definitely become something where like this is why this kind of studying works, and this is why you should sleep, and this is why like you should reduce stress, and all these things that like make for healthful learning, and since we're something like 51% of the students we have at UMass are first in family to go to college. A lot of them don't have that kind of background knowledge about like you can't just study by staring at a screen repeatedly. You actually need to read and engage and like give yourself feedback and assessments and stuff like that. So it's been a rewarding class to teach in that way because I will occasionally get students come back to me a year or so later and say, yeah, actually my grades improved substantially after taking your class because no one ever actually taught me that studying was like a skill. So I'm always pretty pleased when I get that kind of feedback.
If this gets out, it's going to become a requisite class.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it should be.
You're listening to Therapy for the World, an interview series with kind, thought-provoking people working along the spectrum of self-care and world care. I'm Dan, a writing therapist and teacher, and this is my conversation with Richard Hunter, an associate psychology professor and neuroepigenetics researcher. We recorded this conversation in early 2024, so it's a bit outdated, but hopefully still fresh. Happy listening.
I'm much more in terms of my discipline and what I do at the bench, kind of a cell biologist and things like that. But I'm privileged to be able to kind of think a lot across a lot of, layers of analysis where I can think about human stuff through, I've worked with Ed Tronick now for many years. And I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he sort of developed this. He's most famous for developing something called the still face paradigm, which is basically you have a mom and a baby and the mom just blanks out her face for 2 minutes. And this is really distressing to infants. They'll start freaking out sometimes within seconds. And again, it's only 2 minutes, but you have this big disruption just from that lack of immediate feedback from the mom. And conversations with him have sort of led me to sort of thinking about like these bigger, more human aspects of things where like just how like that micro scale feedback, we were talking earlier about mouthing words and communicating, like how much, moment to moment communication is important in human beings. That so like, I have a very broad perspective or a very broad set of irons in the fire, I guess, intellectually as a consequence of that and this
Yeah.
class and so forth on. Yeah.
That's definitely an impression I got. You're at the crossroads of biology and psychology, but also other fields. How did you get to this specific juncture in academia?
I mean, I've always been a bit of an oddball. Like I started my collegiate career as a medieval history major, because that was what I was, really curious. I'm still very curious about ancient medieval history, but I decided at some point that I didn't find it that I was getting much more in classes as I could get from just reading the books. And, my family, my dad's a medical doctor, and as is my brother, and my mom was working on her PhD in pharmacology when I was born. So there's a heavy biological background. So I got into biology as I went through my undergraduate career. And, my best class, and in fact, the only class I think as an undergraduate I got the best grade in class was cell biology. And it was taught all in forms of design an experiment to do X. And so all the tests you had to design experiments for, that was all the answers to all the questions. And I realized I was good at that, and good at and really enjoyed pulling apart scientific papers, and still do. I really love cell biology. And I was also really blessed at University of Texas at Austin, where I went to undergrad, that they pushed you into taking a very broad biology curriculum if you're a bio major. So, I had to take a lab in ecology and evolutionary biology. So we're out in the woods, like looking at leafcutter ant mounds and counting, species distributions across like little hectare plots. And then I had to take you know, uh, zoology class, a botany class, a microbiology class. I took one of my favorite classes went on bacteriophage genetics. So, which like no one does that below the graduate level anywhere, but it was just a wonderful class because the guy who taught it, that was his life and love. And so I got a lot of passion about a lot of subjects that at the time didn't really fit into any kind of plan, like in terms of like, this is just taking a lot of biology courses that are cool. Since then, the fact that I took that bacteriophage genetics course and I took those ecology courses, has fed into the way I think about a lot of different things, because, ecology is important for human affairs as it is for, bacteria or rodents or anything. And the bacteriophage genetics really gave me a kind of like set of ideas in the back of my mind about how genetic and genomic systems work and how many different ways they can work. Because, usually if you go through, you take genetics, you might be taught a little bit about how fungal systems work, but only really to talk about like Josh Lederberg's work in Neurospora crassa or something like that to demonstrate this or that point. But most of it's focused on mammals and maybe peas because of Mendel. But if you think about the bacterial world or the viral world, there's so many different systems of information transfer. And I think that particular class kind of liberated my mind about thinking about how information works in biology. And it works a lot more broadly than, sort of you're taught as an undergraduate or a high school student or something like that. And I think even a lot of people who are specialists in biology outside of sort of pure genomics, like, are really unaware of how much complexity there is to information transfer, even in very simple systems like, bacteria.
How does one who studies that, procure funding for studying this? I get the sense that in academia, you have to sort of explain how this field is going to solve all our biggest problems in the world, just to to get funding. And generally, you have to argue that way.
Well, the answer is it's been kind of hard. I've managed to sort of eke it out, and I feel, I feel very lucky that I haven't really had to do that kind of like special pleading too much, but I haven't had a lot of funds come in. I've been able to publish quite a bit, I think, by being smart about, how I design my experiments, and lucky, and the graduate students I've had work for me. But yeah, it's a challenge because if you want to work across fields, like you lose something to specialists, and you also lose something if you're really trying to push new ways of thinking about how biological systems or just systems in general work. Because again, I think my intuition is that information is kind of it's a general property of the universe, and I think there are physicists who probably agree with me. And I'll not get too far over my skis and talk about what information means from the physics perspective. But I think that whether you're talking about language in humans or social communication in fruit flies or horizontal gene transfer in systems of, bacterial colonies, there are general principles that adhere in all those cases, and
like what?
Well, I think there is a tendency in living systems to maintain coherence of information. That sounds smarter than it is. It just means that living systems try not to die. In a very simple sense. But in a more profound sense, like, any individual living organism is basically trying to maintain a coherent state over time. And, the curious thing about that is that it's never really the same, molecules. Say, I probably don't contain many of the same molecules I started life with, and I think, thinking from, a more psychodynamic perspective, I mean, we have this idea of self, say, that, in the West we're very adherent to, but if you've been through psychoanalysis, say, or really had to work on, a psychological problem, if you take, for instance, if you've been diagnosed with personality disorder or something like that, you have to let go of that self, and yet you're still the same person after 5-10 years of therapy. Um, and, and I think that's the interesting wrinkle to me, is like, what is that information, is also kind of an identity, but it's an identity that's preserved almost like a standing wave. It's like the constituents of it are never necessarily the same. And, but there's still this identity to it, this particular bacteria is E. coli and its daughter cells are still E. coli, no matter where they are or what they're doing.
Are you familiar with the analogy of the ship of Theseus? It's I have maybe.
Yeah, spell it out for me again. I did.
I might be mispronouncing it like pretty horribly. But it's this thought experiment founded in some reality, where there's a ship, and this ship has to go through some repairs. You have to replace the ship is called the ship of Theseus, and you have to replace its wooden planks. You have to replace the steering wheel, the sails. Here's me inventing ship parts, like the rudder, all the parts that you have to just replace over time. And so over the course of 3 centuries of repairs on this ship, none of the parts are the original part, and it's still called the ship of Theseus. Is it still the ship of Theseus if none of its original parts are there? It seems a little bit analogous to what you're describing.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of one of the really interesting things about biology and just, again, information in general, is that it in kind of a core insight that I had a long time ago about just biology, biochemistry, I think probably in graduate school, and brains, is that, when I was training, in the late 90s, neuroplasticity, we sort of just discovered that, you have these structural changes in dendrites as a consequence of things like stress and experience, or you have neurogenesis that changes in response to exercise or stress. And so this idea that the brain was plastic in adult humans was quite novel now. I mean, now everybody's sort of like, oh yeah, everyone's neuroplastic, and, everyone should be doing psilocybin to increase their plasticity or whatever. Which there's some truth to that, but, everything in moderation. But it's really stuck with me because I realized, just, again, because I came from a medical family and realized that a lot of the early knowledge about neuroscience was neuroanatomy. And most of that was done in cadavers, right? Most of our anatomical knowledge going back, to Vesalius in the 16th century is, it's dissection of corpses, and corpses are not changing in the way that living things do. I mean, they're deliquescing and rotting, but that's a different kind of change. And I kind of realized, the more biochemistry I learned, that, most of these structures that maintain, say, a dendrite, that's the skeletal support for that, if you will, is a microtubule or sets of microtubules. And those are really just maintained by adding subunits to one end and losing them from another end. So like, they're much less like, a girder in a building than they are like a moving sidewalk, and that they're continually adding units and losing units. And so every bit of biology in a living system is more like a standing wave than it is like, an erector set. And, for that reason, I've always I've sort of stuck to that view of things that we shouldn't think about living systems as static, and you shouldn't think about information as a static, or, something, you can just pen the fly on a piece of paper, and that is what it is. So I think, that kind of broader, more dynamicist view of biology and behavior and the like is sort of what underpins a lot of my thinking about these things. And I think it's one of the ways that makes it easy for me to kind of move around a little bit more than average, is because someday I need to sit down and actually systematize this so I can be famous or something. But it is sort of a way of thinking about biology that allows me to think about a lot of different
We
aspects
can
of
start
biology.
now to systematize it. I mean, it sounds like you're describing this constant changing, ever changing regeneration in things and in places and in people.
Yeah,
History too, right?
yeah,
Like nations going through leaders,
yeah,
and the nation remains the same nation but under different leadership and different people. A nation's people change every 150
yeah,
years. So do its
yeah,
buildings, and so do so many of
yeah,
its conflicts and like the things they're arguing about. But yet it's the
yeah,
same nation. Uh, so
yeah,
so it definitely has like wide applicability. You also study a lot of stress and anxiety, and what that does to
yeah.
us. How does that affect like this ladder of generation that you're describing?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, because again, the broad way I tend to think about stress is that stress is something that you at least have to you perceive the need to adapt to for survival reasons, right? That's why we have a stress response, is to mobilize the systems and energy resources within our bodies to, say, survive being attacked by a bear, or a fight with a conspecific or another person or another dog if you're a dog, or whatever you choose to be, or were chosen to be. But so it's a survival system, and the interesting thing about it, and again, this sort of gets to where this dynamism comes in, is you're taking something away from other processes, so highly stressed children can be physically stunted because they're putting energy into stress responses, right? They're stressing out, or they're having defensive reactions to their parents, or they're hiding from their parents, or any number of things that might have a physiologic energetic cost. So they're not growing because they're having to mount the stress response and pushing glucose out into their tissues, so that they're ready for a fight or flight response all the time, as opposed to storing it away and using it to build more child. So stress is an interesting way of thinking about a lot of things. It's also, so you can talk about it at this evolutionary level where it's a survival trait, at this individual level where it's you're making these trade-offs with your environment in order to survive, and in early development, because we're much more plastic when we're younger. Those can have big effects on your trajectory. If you have there's a whole literature on what are called adverse childhood experiences. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's started in the first papers were like the late 90s. And basically, there've been how many of these things do you have? And they listed 10 childhood adversities, so like physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, parental divorce, parental incarceration, so forth and so on, and modifications of it since. And it's a fairly substantial literature now. But the initial papers, they just asked people, they found that people that had 4 or more of these had enormously elevated medical risk, so that they had something like 4 times the risk of developing liver disease, 3 times the risk of lung disease, and sort of on maybe more obvious, but I think epidemiologically really surprising, their risk of IV drug use went up 4,000%. The risk of a suicide attempt before 18 went up 5,000%. Those are huge effect sizes. And this first study was done with a population of 17,000 people. So it was a very big sample size. And since it's been replicated all over the world. So you have these really profound effects of these early life trajectories being set by having a stressful or traumatizing environment that affects you in all these ways that aren't just, like in a certain sense, it's like, well, of course, if you had a bad childhood, you're more likely to have a suicide attempt, but are you 5,000% more likely? I mean, that's a huge, if you think about, like, if you smoke for 20 years, your risk of lung cancer goes up, I think, about 200%. Like, it's a huge difference. Um, and that sort of insight has sort of led me to think a lot about, like, how much initial conditions, condition where you wind up, but also what do you do about that? Because, you ask someone who's coming in your clinic is, say, 25 years old, or 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever, and they tell you they had these things, what do you do with that? I mean, you're like,
You're right that despite how enriching their environment may be
Yeah,
later, it's not enough to counteract that those initial
yeah,
experiences, those set time periods that cause lifelong epigenetic
yeah.
changes.
And that's sort of the hard problem for me is that, yes, we have a lot of neuroplasticity. We're capable of adapting. And yes, I think about things in dynamic terms, but also like you get this, Waddington, who invented the term epigenetics, talks about this concept of canalization. And you may have seen this picture. It's like basically a ball rolling down a sort of a hill, and there's different valleys that the ball might choose to go down. It's pretty widely replicated whenever anyone's talking about epigenetics. And it's the problem of epigenetics or of plasticity developmentally is that you make choices and you get committed to those choices. And so, thesis of the ship may wind up a different ship, but it could wind up a number of different ships in a number of different ports, depending on the early turnings it makes on thesis of journey, um, and and it becomes more challenging to get out of those, the further you go down a particular track. And that's sort of like, the promise of epigenetics, and I guess kind of the pop way of interpreting is that, oh, your mind is infinitely plastic, but the tragedy is that it is plastic, but it's not that plastic, and once you're sort of set in a channel in your life, it's very hard to get out. But again, what's interesting about that is how much, and the question I don't have an answer to, but I'm very curious about is how much of that stuff that we would read out, or at least people like me would read out, as a set of epigenetic marks on, plasticity genes like BDNF or FKBP5 or yada, yada, yada. Um, acronym. Uh, you know, is how much of that is really a result of that biochemistry, or versus how much of that biochemistry is because you built that in as a learning pattern in your brain, and you sort of set threat detection level or ambiguity interpretation levels towards detecting threat, so that you're in this reinforced shell where that you see threat in ambiguous interactions, then you act threatened, which creates more challenging interactions for yourself as your life goes on, and maybe even, I know this is sort of a truism and kind of self-help, psychology circles, but the people who have been through trauma tend to find themselves around traumatizing people more easily than those who haven't, because maybe that was normal for you growing up. And that is a hard thing for a lot of people who've been through trauma as children, is to realize that it isn't normal and to not minimize their experience. And if you don't stop minimizing it, you wind up with people who are like the family of origin that traumatized you. And so where those lines are, I don't think anyone knows in terms of, how much of this is because you've got a bunch of methyl marks on this promoter of this gene, and so you're just kind of stuck with that. Are those methyl marks there because you've been imprinted in with this particular learning? That means you interact with people in a certain way, and also maybe you interact with a certain type of people more often than not because that's what you're kind of canalized into.
It's a fascinating and terrifying question because it like bodes the future of a therapy
Yeah.
or a therapeutic intervention. Like, can you even be stopped?
Yeah.
In this maladaptive trait, in this type of relationship that you keep
Yeah.
repeating. We get that a lot in romantic
Yeah.
relationships,
Yeah.
and in psychoanalysis, it's asked as well as far as repetition compulsion goes.
Yeah.
Like we all repeat these thought patterns or action patterns that are not good for us and we certainly don't enjoy, which is why we go to therapy. But going to therapy is not enough to then stop it.
Right.
Maybe not even years of therapy
Yeah.
is enough to stop it. So it's really interesting to hear that there's something on the genetic level
Yeah.
that could speak to why it's so hard to unglue ourselves from that pattern.
Yeah, and I think there is. I mean, I think the way we are is instantiated in our biology. I'm not, even though I talk about all these things intersecting. Like, we have a particular biology as human beings that is conditioned by chemistry and physics and cell biology and all these other things. And yeah, I think a lot of the things that one would experience in therapy or as a therapist are because these systems are built this way. But again, like, what's so hard for me is the biologists don't talk to the psychoanalysts very much, and so we haven't really had a good conversation about where's the boundary, where it's the conditions that you find yourself in externally. Like, how possible it is to say take someone out of their habitual environment and put them in some kind of milieu intervention where they're not allowed to interact with people who are validating their perceptions or their canalization.
Or you
Yeah.
get shocked every single time you like talk badly to yourself, for example, to like name
Yeah,
another sort
yeah, if
of.
you want to go full B.F. Skinner, yeah, sure. Well, yeah, but I mean, it is a question, and it's been a tension, on in that the interface between biology, and psychology and neurology and all that for a very long time because, I mean, you do change people's behavior by shocking them a lot, and you change rabbit's behavior or pigeon's behavior, that kind of intervention is powerful, but we also know from that very behaviorist literature that kind of punishment, for instance, way of doing things often has negative spillover effects because you get complexes and superstitions around the punishment, and
And fear of authority and much more. Yeah.
yeah. So you're building another complex, and I would actually argue if you're doing that to someone who has a history of trauma, you're probably just repeating the trauma in a new, more scientific way. So it's not, you're kind of just doing the thing you're trying to undo. Which is why, like reward and why I think, having a therapist who can do that kind of unconditional acceptance, which is really hard, having been a human for 50 odd years now, like it's hard to be unconditionally accepting of somebody. I mean, being a teacher has made it, I have learned that skill over time, like, and learn that people come from a lot of different places, but if you haven't been through some kind of therapeutic training or you haven't had to teach, or probably parenting would help too, but you're limited to your own perspective, and it's hard to be there and accept someone, and you want, even if you love them and want to fix them, and the impulse to fix can override the acceptance, which is really what, I think people need to open themselves up to some kind of change. And I think that's kind of probably what's operating with things like psilocybin, is that you kind of open doors for people that the biology has canalized, right? Because we do know that psilocybin is changing fairly rapidly, dendritic structures and things like that. You start seeing a lot more wiggly dendrites, and when you're looking at mice that are on psilocybin than you would normally. So there's a window.
What does that mean that you see dendrites? What is
Wait,
that? What is
wiggly,
the
wiggly, yeah, wiggly
consequence?
dendrites. Well, so I think the dominant theory about how memory is structurally instantiated in modern neuroscience is that basically it's synaptic connections, right? And so the dendrite is the receiving end of a synaptic connection, and then you have an axonal bouton that sticks onto that. And we know that in younger animals and people, you have a lot more what are called filopodial spines on those dendrites. And the spines are the sites of a lot of the synaptic interactions. And they're little wiggly things that sort of arise, and then if something doesn't synapse on them, they fade away. And as the synapse stabilizes, and we think a long-term memory becomes stabilized, it becomes stubby, and then it becomes mushroom-like. I'm sure Larry would appreciate. So it gets stronger in physical size and also synaptic strength over time. And it seems in people who are older, the predominant type of spine is mushroom-like. So older people have more long-term memories, but they're less and less filopodial spines. So these sort of ones that are available to learn new things. And it seems with psilocybin, you get an activation of more filopodial dendrites, so that there's more of this available sites for synaptic interaction or new synapse formation. I think we're early days in terms of understanding that, because we haven't been able to do that kind of research with psilocybin for a very long time. I mean, actually, no one ever did that research. We didn't have the technical capacity to look at dendrites in real time back in the 40s, 50s, 60s when that stuff was starting. But now we do, and it does seem like there's an opening of a physical, structural, plastic window that occurs when psilocybin is in the brain. And I don't think we know yet very much about what's happening epigenetically. I've started to see some papers on that front, but I don't have a firm opinion about like what that means. But we do know that those structural changes are linked to epigenetic changes in the neurons.
When you say that there might be epigenetic changes as far as psilocybin is concerned, does that have anything to do with generational transferring of these bonds? Is that the relevance of that, or?
It could. I mean, so yeah, that's a complicated subject, but it's one I'm happy to talk about because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. We know that there is epigenetic transfer across as many as 3 generations. And that happens because if you have a mom who is going through a traumatic experience while she has a baby, or perhaps has a history of trauma, and so she's transmitting her stress responsiveness to just day-to-day quotidian insults to her baby, that baby is going to pick up an epigenetic program from her mom's stress responses. But because your germline cells, your sperm or your eggs are also, going to be the grandchild, they're also being programmed at the same time as the baby is. So that means that a traumatized mother is programming not only her daughter, but potentially her granddaughter or grandson. Most epigenetic effects we see, at least in animal models, where we can look at the details in a lot more sort of molecular detail, um, seem to show that kind of 3-generation persistence, and then there's a fall off unless there's some kind of repetition, so that traumatizing people traumatize, so if the behaviors persist, so that if you're a traumatized child, it becomes a traumatizing parent, then it can transmit. But the biology seems like it can run off. It'll just run down after 3 generations. So there's an out there in terms of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
If you do go to therapy, if you do, I mean, psilocybin-assisted therapy does seem really good for PTSD, which is something that shows up in that particular story. So I think, yeah, there's a way to stop that and change that if you have the right therapeutic interventions, you can really change that for people, because the epigenetics is not genetics, which is the good thing about it. It's your DNA base pair sequence doesn't change a lot generation. Well, I mean, changes 50% because you're mixing it up with sex, but those genes are they're going to be those genes, and they're going to be passed on from generation to generation. Whereas the epigenetic stuff, how those genes are sort of, the regulatory knobs and dials on them are set, can change a lot more. And again, that sort of speaking back to the evolutionary value of these stress responses and these kind of programs is that, there's benefit in that. A lot of the way we think about why this happens is that while you're in utero, your mom is telling you what the world is like, so that when you get out as a baby organism, you're programmed for the world that she's been experiencing. And if that world is dangerous and humans are threatening in it, you're set up to succeed. And success doesn't mean you're happy. It just means you're alive as far as biology is concerned. And so being, good at threat detection is good in certain circumstances. There's a figure, I forgot where I first read it, but that, in pre-modern societies, something like 25% of male deaths were due to homicide. And if you think if as a man, you have a 1 in 4 chance of being murdered by another man, or maybe a woman too, I don't want to be sexist about it, then being, basically having the phenotype of PTSD is probably adaptive. If you sleep lightly and are quick to interpret ambiguous stimuli as threat, you're more likely to live through someone who sleeps through the night quite easily and gets bashed over the head by a rival. So, which is, one way I tend to think about PTSD is that it's maybe not so much simply a disease as it is a part of our behavioral repertoire, possible behavioral phenotypes, that in certain situations, if you were growing up in Afghanistan in the past 40 years, and if Afghanistan has very high rates of PTSD, it might have been useful. You might have been more likely to live if you showed that phenotype than if you didn't. And, and I think perhaps a lot of our mental illness in some degree or another comes from that kind of mismatch, because the modern world is not like the evolved human world in many ways at all. And so we have this repertoire that's built into us genetically and epigenetically that sometimes just is not matched to the relatively wonderful world we live in nowadays. I mean, Most of the world is better than it was 100, 200, 300, certainly 400 or 500 years ago. And certainly, 1,000, 10,000 years ago, in terms of our chances of survival and our disease burden and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
You hear that with food as well sometimes. I come from a family that once ago was filled with folks who left Europe at a time of famine. And we joke, now at the abundant dinner table, that we can't stop eating because we're afraid that there won't be any more food. And there's, I don't know, is that a joke, or are we actually speaking the truth there?
No, it's interesting. There's a whole body of knowledge now on that, and there's several layers to it. I mean, one is that, speaking people leaving Europe in the last century. So some of the earliest bits of epigenetic data we have from humans are things from like the Dutch hunger winter in 44, 45, where children who were in the womb in that winter wound up with a lot of metabolic problems, or much more likely to be obese than their siblings who were born on either side of that starvation period. And you actually see similar things in Finland during the Soviet occupation. So there are a lot of World War II era things where people have, and also Rachel Yehuda has done a lot of work with Holocaust survivors, where you actually see changes in epigenetic marks for stress and metabolic genes in people who are children of Holocaust survivors, and in some cases even grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So yeah, no, there is good epigenetic data that your family's recent history does have an effect on programming your metabolic system and probably your drive to eat. But again, with humans, it's complicated because we tell each other stories, and which is one of the things I love about the broad definition of epigenetics is it's just information transfer above the level of the coding sequence of the genes. So language is epigenetic in that sense, and humans are really good at epigenetics. We have a lot of different systems that other organisms don't have. So you can tell yourself stories about like, oh yeah, well, you should eat up because, back on the shtetl or wherever you might have come from, we didn't get food because the Cossacks came and burned it, or, whatever those stories are.
And who to be, afraid of as well, who to trust.
Yeah, exactly. But underneath that is you do have this biological programming in stress systems that means that you're maybe more tuned to threat detection. And if your family tells you a story about where to orient that threat detection, then you're going to be more likely to point it in that direction.
Sure.
And that probably explains, some visceral aspects of things like racism, is that people, they have come from a history of trauma in some way or shape or form, and their family blamed some other group for that.
Right.
And, that's one way you get there.
Which is never to say it was that group or that was actually the threat. It's simply what was the blame attributed, or where was that threat placed? Yeah. You mentioned the word acceptance earlier, and I thought I feel like it captures a lot of this. The therapeutic aid there might be in saying, okay, well, this is just the way I am. Now let me see what I can do with that, right? Reading one of your papers on I think it was in the epigenetics of anxiety. There was a part about maternal transmission of stress responsiveness that I sent to my sister, where it says something about maternal behavior and molecular mechanisms are, both demonstrably involved. And we love our mom, but of course, like, your parents do things to you sometimes, and you're like, well, this is not me, and this is something we get often in therapy, right? Like, this response is not mine. This thought is not mine. This is not something I either believe or sponsor, but I'm like, I am it incarnate right now. How can I extract it from myself? Right.
Yeah. It's a fascinating problem. I mean, having been through a fair amount of therapy myself, and also, like being a bad meditator, you realize that like, there's a lot of things that you do that like aren't you. And like, they don't really relate to the way you construct yourself when you're, sort of, I am making statements. I am this, I am rational, I am that, like, my parents were cognitively kind of interesting in that my mother was the child of engineers. And so she was very good with tools and, could do tensor calculus, like all this higher level math and things like that. And my father, who was a medical doctor, was horrible with anything mechanical. I mean, I remember coming home one day and he was actually managed to break a screwdriver, which is an accomplishment, it's a testament to his strength, if not his ingenuity. And because he would just get frustrated with mechanical things. And I notice with myself sometimes, like when I'm having trouble with, say, a computer or something like that, I'll curse and I'll use the same language my dad did, except I'm not actually that challenged by those things. I saw that response in, the male figure and my paternal figure, that's how you respond when machines don't do it. So you curse at them. Whereas my mom, since I don't have that imprint in terms of like what I'm supposed to be doing as a boy, like I still have, I guess, her cognitive side, and that I like to sit down and take things apart and fix them, but I do it while cursing, because that's how dad interacted with
that's how you do that. That's how you learned the formatting.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
no,
there's another side to this also, that going back to that study about, was it 3,000%, 500%? I can't remember how much likelier you are to commit suicide, but just a huge effect from childhood.
5,000% increase in attempts before the age of 18.
I appreciate the precision.
Which is huge.
Attempts. The other side to this, and it's something you write a little bit about too, that I'm not sure if 0 stressful or traumatic experiences is better than 4. There's resilience to stress can be instilled through controlled and controllable exposure to stress, which is something we also hear in self-help psychology, that you should have a couple bad experiences, and parents sometimes joke about this too. Like, my kid is so pampered, like they're never having any bad, like 0 bad experiences, which is supposed to be a good thing, but apparently it also helps us find ways.
No,
it's not a good thing.
It's not a good thing. No, I mean, like, stress, partially because of people like me, or at least some of the people who train me, like, it has this, and this wasn't anyone's intention on my side of the, neurobiology of stress field, but stress has this negative reputation now, because we do know it does contribute to all kinds of different pathologies. But if you have to drill down into like what the actual science is, and the science is very much distinguishes, Bruce McEwen, who is my postdoctoral mentor and probably the father of the study of the biology of stress, or at least neurobiology of stress, because I guess Selye can take the claim of stress overall, but is that, he talked about eustress, which is stress which actually has a positive impact on you, and exercise is kind of the most obvious example of that. Is like, exercise tends to improve not only your exercise performance, but your cognitive functioning, your mood, and your overall survivability. So, but if you look at it neurochronologically or neurochemically, all the same hormones are coursing through your body when you're going for a jog as it are when you're being attacked by a man with a knife, or when you're repressing and getting really angry at your boss or something like that. But the exercise is controllable. So controllability is really important. So you need controllable stressors in order to be a functional adult, I think, in many ways, and that's why having no stress, or assuming that all stressful experiences are negative, is really bad for people, because you get stronger, I think, morally, intellectually, cognitively, in the same way you get stronger in the gym, is that you do things that are progressively controllable, greater challenges for yourself. Like, you don't go into the gym if you want to have a 300-pound bench press and try and bench press 300 pounds the first time you're in there. You'll probably break some ribs, right? You'll go in there and you'll just lift the bar the first time, and the next time you add 5 pounds to either side, and so forth and so on, and you progressively escalate the load on your system as your system is able to adapt to it. And that way you get to, getting big pectoral muscles or whatever your goal is in going to the gym. But you can't do it all the first day. And which is, everyone this time of year in the States, at least, is going through the discovery that, like, you can't just decide to make a New Year's resolution and get fit in a month and a half or whatever. So yeah, I mean, stress, you need it. And I mean, that was sort of, I alluded earlier to Ed Tronick's work with the still face paradigm. And he has this idea of, I actually wrote a paper called Quotidian Resilience. And his idea about how parental interaction works is that basically, in very early life with infants, the mother is second to second almost regulating their infant's emotions by just being responsive and making faces when the baby makes faces and giving that kind of moment to moment feedback. And as the child develops, it, and you can see this with children, they get further and further away from their parent. At some point, they start telling their parent no. And the parent, if they're doing a successful job of parenting, or being a good enough parent is his term, because there's no such thing as perfect parenting, we'll give them the space to do that, but also set a boundary. Like, if the child's really losing it and really violating some boundaries, then maybe they get a raised voice, or maybe they get told to go to the room, or whatever sort of the developmentally appropriate thing to do. But the child has to go through that stepping away, and has to go through telling mom no, and being you have to be a confrontational teenager to start to build that boundary around yourself so you can become an autonomous adult, and you have to piss your parents off, and your parents have to be available to be pissed off in a way that's not destructive, but that's stressful for all parties involved. Like, no one describes raising a teenager as like, oh yeah, that was totally chill, for all of us. It was great, or a 2-year-old, for that matter.
Controllable,
but it's really important that
controllable is one part of that. So you want to make sure that it's something that you can mediate or measure and stop at some point, leave the gym if you're done with it. And also recovery, I think, right? Like, you get to recover from that traumatic or stressful experience. To call the gym traumatic might be accurate, but you get to recover from it. at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of like I actually wrote a book a year or so ago about called The Power of Discord, which is about how important, not just in childhood relationships, but in adult relationships, being able to have a fight, have a conflict, and then repair it, and then repair it, and then repair it. That repair is really, which again, my whole dynamic way of thinking about things where it's, talking back to microtubules earlier, like you're always repairing the microtubule that keeps that dendrite where it's supposed to be. You're always adding bits on the end. And I think human relationships are kind of operating that way too. There's always something falling off in your relationships. There's always something that needs to be fixed. And as long as you're fixing it good enough, you have good relationships, you have, secure attachment or whatever it is you're going to label that as. And if you're not, you're blowing things apart, and you're on a trajectory towards unsuccessful relationships and unhappiness and too much stress. There is a limit, there's this Bruce, my mentor, talked all the time about the inverted U, and this shows up in a lot of biology, but it's basically a very Episcopalian idea in that it's moderation in all things, right? There's a point you kind of want to have this much cortisol sort of in the middle of that range, because your memory is better when you have some cortisol, which is your major stress hormone in your system. Like you can't actually learn a lot of things if you don't have a little spike of cortisol around the learning event. You need to also have a little spike of dopamine around the learning event. So you need these things to be changing some, but if you get too high, then you start to actually degrade synaptic connections. So you're interfering with memory. And so people who are going through really pronounced, prolonged chronic stress might actually start to have trouble forming new memories. Their memory, the quality of their memory, their recall will decline. And you'll actually see in people who have very chronic depression or PTSD where the hippocampus, which is the structure that's involved in forming new long-term memories, it shrinks. Or it may be shrunken from childhood. There's still questions about exactly how that's happening. The prefrontal cortex, which is where your working memory is happening and is also involved in telling your hippocampus to remember things, it can decline in volume with chronic stress and things like that. So you're changing the structure of your brain when you're overwhelmed chronically by things you can't control. Whereas if you're in a good space where you can get out there and engage with things in a way that is a stretch, it's not because, you don't want to just sort of keep playing the same game of solitaire over and over for the rest of your life because it's controllable. You want to stretch some, but you don't want to stretch so far, that you're a baby who's trying to run before it's learned to crawl, or, you're someone who's had challenging childhood relationships and just go off and marry the first person you meet and expect it to work, and, I'm sure as a therapist, you've seen people who just like, oh, yep, you didn't really do the work of rebuilding your capacity for attachment and figuring out in a safe way how to relate and to manage your relationships. And so, yeah, of course, your first marriage blew up.
Do you have any ideas about how to it's training is what you're describing basically, right? Like training as far as relationships goes, gym goes. How do we train stress? Is there some clear answer around that? As beyond childhood, maybe,
Well, I mean, childhood is a place for it, but I mean, there are plenty of places where you can train stress, and I think there are a number of different ways. I mean, the military does it for extreme stress somewhat successfully. I mean, obviously people still go through military training and wind up with PTSD, but they've been training people to function under highly stressful circumstances for a long time. And I don't think that's the model we should take into day-to-day civilian life. But it's, yeah. But I do think it points out that this is something that you can, as an adult, do, is improve your stress resilience. And exercise by itself is good. It just seems like, that not only does it, again, train your body, but it improves your cognitive flexibility. And this is one of the things that emerges also is that, we talk about flexibility and plasticity, is that the more stress you're under, the more rigid your thinking is. So the more prone you are to sort of keep the fixed ideas and keep the fixed perceptions of things. So like if you were, raised in a racist household, and you're super stressed, and, it's much less likely that you're going to let go of those ideas about the world, while you're super stressed, which is, why you might see that and say, and, to speak a little bit to American politics, which I know no one wants to, why, say a white underclass person or poor person in the United States might have some racist ideas, it's because they're really distressed about their status within society, and if they came from a traumatized background, they're not getting resourced to deal with it, and so that's not the moment they're going to change their mind about that. Whereas if you are in better health mentally or physically, you have more flexibility and capacity to say like, yeah, that's kind of a dumb idea, and I don't
Or
think,
if you know how to identify the threat a little bit better,
yeah,
right? Like the
yeah,
threat is not the person next to you. The threat is something in power or someone in power
yeah, yeah,
generally.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's your boss at work, or it's the horrible political system we have right now, or whatever. And then you might develop the efficacy to try and do something about it, as opposed to just blaming Group X for your particular plight. And and yeah, I mean, so that's the interesting thing about physical exercise is it actually enhances cognitive flexibility, so it opens you up to being able to make those changes. The problem is that, like, I don't think just being a fitness influencer is an elevated state of being, say, I think, but it is an example of something you can do to improve your overall resilience. And then the other places is, I think that's basically how most forms of talk psychotherapy work. And there are different ways of structuring it. CBT is much more like a hardcore personal trainer, where it's like, do that, this many reps, this many times, and you will be swole, or whatever, your goal is. And the more psychodynamic oriented stuff is more about actually maybe actively working through those relational styles and things like that, and getting a phase of acceptance that maybe didn't have or hadn't had experience of, getting a good exposure to that, and then kind of working outwards from that to a more resilient coping style, or whatever you choose to call it. So I think, I think there's a lot of different ways to train this, and meditation probably plays a role too, and but that's a particular set of things. That's about being able to observe internal states to some extent, and to disidentify yourself with some of these other things, like your thoughts. I mean, one of the more interesting things I heard from a Buddhist perspective recently that stuck with me for a few months is the idea that thoughts cause suffering, and that had always sort of been in the background, but it kind of crystallized for me recently, maybe because I meditated enough to realize that, like, oh yeah, when I just start thinking about things without like something I'm trying to do with my thoughts, I'm just stuck with my thoughts, my mood tends to decline, you know? And I don't know if that's true of everybody, but the fact that, that's part of Buddhist thought was like, yeah, our brains can just tell us things that aren't helpful or true. And realizing that the voice in your head isn't necessarily even your voice. I mean, that was an interesting thing about, learning to meditate. We talked about the stuff that, oh, that's like my dad, or that's like my mom, or whoever. But also like the thoughts you have. So many of them are like, you're repeating something that was on the radio, or like, just as an exercise, thinking about like how many things go through your head that are really you. Most of them aren't, most of them are just, they're kind of dross. You're repeating radio or a conversation you had with someone else, or just an old script that's something your parents said to you about, like, well, you don't know how to behave, or you don't know this or that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to kind of train that, and like most things, there with learning there's definitely sort of transfer, specificity, and that, some things are probably better for different types of stress resilience. Like military training is probably really good for if people are going to shoot at you, which most of us are not looking to do. Whereas, some kind of relational oriented psychotherapy, or, dialectical behavioral DBT, if you have a really kind of pathological coping style because you had a really traumatizing childhood, like being able to learning to identify emotions and cope with them internally, that's maybe the thing you need to be doing, and that's how you're building resilience.
I think that several of the fields we mentioned, meditation, my very basic view of genetics, and I'm in group theater in here too, but just all these different practices that allow us to zoom out and observe what is going on. I'm kind of imagining like flying over my DNA sequences and saying like, wow, that's fascinating. Like, look at that. Here's me just speaking gibberish in science, but like here's like this sequence here that's gonna lead me to get really mad at this really inconsequential thing. Like, isn't that fascinating? Isn't that crazy? Like, okay, let me just keep flying over this. Like I'm not gonna
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
gonna go there right now. You know that,
yeah.
and that's kind of what meditation does too. It's super fascinating, everything, and I appreciated also how you distill the difference between
Mhm.
psychoanalysis and CBD,
Well,
CBT, CBT, as far as treating like the root of
yeah,
whatever this maladaptive strategy is versus
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
retrain it. I think
I
they
agree.
complement
Yeah.
each other in that way really interestingly. Yeah, this has
Yeah.
been so interesting, Richard. Thank you so much for bridging psychology and biology as you described it earlier. I have a couple quick fire questions for you if you're
Sure.
interested.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I'm calling it lightning round actually, not quick fire, just
Okay.
to leave that this military complex that we're both in.
Uh-huh.
A skill you're currently working on.
I'm always working on rock climbing. That's been kind of a pursuit of mine since I was a kid. So that's I guess would be the one I'm currently working on. Not the only one, but yeah.
Cool. One. A favorite way to relax.
Um, Fear, meditation,
Together.
and reading.
Together.
Yeah,
Beer, meditation, and reading together.
beer and meditation doesn't go as well together, but you can have a beer and read a book. Yeah, I'm a bibliomaniac. I think I have like something like 10,000 old books in my house, so that's a pretty.
A book that left a lasting impression on you.
That's hard given the amount of books I've read. Um, huh. It's very age specific too. Like I would have said in my late 20s, it would have been like John Fowles' The Magus. I'm trying to think of something recent that really hooked me in that way. That's the hardest question thus far
Okay.
because there's so many. But I think honestly, probably reading some of to give you a science answer, probably reading Waddington's papers when about 15 or so years ago when I started getting interested in this stuff and just the way he thought about how biology interacted with environment, how genes interacted with environment. And he was writing when we barely even realized that DNA was the genetic material. So we didn't know any of the mechanisms. And the clarity of thought he had when thinking about something that we didn't have a physical substrate for has been really influential to me. So I would say on the science side, definitely reading Waddington's work.
Reader friendly too, or is it very esoteric?
I think if you have some background in biology, he's pretty readable. Part of it is because biology wasn't as burdened by jargon in the late 40s and early 50s as it is now. Like now we have,
Sure.
we can't get through a
Or when
conversation.
Aristotle wrote about it too, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. That's another one. Is Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy was another book that like was very interesting to me, but just because, yeah, speaking of very readable, very beautifully, coolly logical, explaining, why people thought what they did across the past 2000 or so years. That's another book that sort of stuck with me. I had a first edition a friend got me, and then I have like a reading copy that's got all sort of little sticky notes on the important points in it. So that's usually a sign that that's an important book to me. Is that I've got my pretty collector's copy, and then the one I've just abused all the hell to take notes in and stuff like
That's a good system.
that. Yeah.
Something you're grateful for?
Well, most recently, my wife. I got married this year, and so I am very happy with my wife and my life with her. Um, yeah, and I just yeah, and beyond that, I just feel really privileged to be able to do the kind of work I get to do. Um, it's nice to be able to at least spend part of your paid time thinking about the kind of things I get to think about. So,
Yeah, that's a pleasure. And lastly, a song or album that you would recommend?
um, well, not knowing your taste, that's a hard one. Um,
Not knowing anyone's taste. How about that?
oh, jeez. Well, the one that's coming to mind, perhaps because it will jar people's perceptions the most, is an album by like a 70s electronic band called The Residents, called Eskimo. And it claims to be re-recordings of Eskimo chant. I told Larry about this, and he was fascinated by it. It's not, and you have to listen closely to figure out what's actually happening in it. But it's a completely bizarre piece of musical history. And if you can find it, listen to it. I don't think most people will like it, but it just leapt to mind as something that I'm pretty sure that most people haven't listened to. And if you're a musically adventurous person, you will get some enjoyment out of it.
I definitely will. I will. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. And yeah.
Thanks for being here. If this conversation resonated with you, consider reviewing Therapy for the World or sharing the link with someone who might appreciate it. Until next time, speak with care and listen deeply.